The hour 9, you still tune in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidiri, and we're going to be looking at South Africa's energy crisis, which may no longer be making daily headlines as it used to, but the debate over Eskom's future is far from over. Government says separating Eskom into three entities, which are generation, transmission, and distribution, is necessary. It's necessary to modernize the electricity sector, to attract investment, and to create a more competitive market. But supporters argue it's a reform that's long overdue. But on the other side, you have the critics who see it quite differently. They warn that unbundling is the first step towards privatization and opening the door for private interests to profit from strategic national infrastructure, while ordinary South Africans are left footing the bill, which is almost the case right now if you look at the price of electricity in South Africa. We'll be speaking to political and energy analyst Tshepo Kgadima, who has gone even further, describing the process as a multi-trillion rand heist. Strong words, but are they justified? Mr. Kgadima, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views.
Assalamu alaikum and greetings to the listeners on Salam Media.
Walaikum salam. I want to jump right into it. You have described Eskom's unbundling as a multi-trillion rand heist. That's a very serious allegation. What evidence leads you to use such rather strong language?
Well, I stand by that assertion. The op-ed that you are referring to, I wrote it on the eve of the general elections in 2024. That is just over 2 years ago. So we can be able to look back over the last 2 years and see if indeed what I wrote has come to pass. And lamentably, it has come to pass. It actually reminds me of the quotation that I reflected in the op-ed by Frédéric Bastiat, the philosopher, the French philosopher, who opined that when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men who, in political science, they would be called comprador bourgeoisie, in a society, and in this case would be South Africa. Over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it, that is plunder, and a moral code that glorifies it. So the rhetoric that comes out every day from the so-called GNU government has effectively, I think, aptly fulfilled that which Frédéric Bastiat really lamented about. And how has that come about? Before the elections in 2024, there was no Ministry of Energy and Electricity. Today, there is an animal called Ministry of Energy and Electricity. It's an oxymoron, actually, to name it that way. That is energy and electricity, number one. But it is now there in cabinet. It's no longer a ministry in the presidency. Secondly, there is a promulgation of 2 pieces of legislation which have effectively legalized this plunder. And those are the National State Enterprises Bill, as well as the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act, that they have effectively legalized, and they've glorified this plunder, this system of plunder, through now coming up with an absurd claim that the so-called National Transmission Company of South Africa will evolve into a transmission system operator, a TSO. And currently, I think moves are underway to now have the actual privatization take effect, because the legislative tools are now in place. And that is what I think one of the commentators, Prince Mtombeni, recently spoke about, the fact that the World Bank had valued the National Transmission Company of South Africa as a TSO to be worth a measly 84 billion rand. That means its balance sheet is only 84 billion rand. And that is a sinisterly determined valuation. initially so to undervalue it so that once it is in the hands of the privateers, it will then recognize its true value, which is 3.1 trillion rand. So effectively here we are being stolen blind right under our noses. And the net result, of course, is that South Africans are going to continue to experience unprecedented energy poverty. Deindustrialization will continue, and the costs of electricity are going to be continuing to spiral as they have, pricing ourselves out of competitiveness scales. And of course, ultimately, the migration from the grid, where we are seeing more and more people resorting to off-grid energy solutions with a hybrid combination of LP gas together with solar with batteries in a home or on a rooftop, that is going to continue to increase. And ultimately, the hard-pressed taxpayer will continue to have to bail out Eskom, and the plunder will continue, because right now Eskom is suggesting constructing a 14,000 kilometer transmission grid to connect the so-called renewable independent power producers who are not independent. Without Eskom, they wouldn't be able to operate. And more so, foot the bill for connecting this so-called renewable independent power producer plants, which after all deliver 100% redundant electricity. And the cost of actually ensuring that that power that they purport to produce can be usable for the economy, it far exceeds any alternative solutions that we can have. So that is the lamentable, really disgrace that I've opined about and continue to do so. But amazed that as the passage of time goes on, the plunder is being perfected through these pieces of legislation and a cabinet, together with a parliament that has wholeheartedly, lock, stock, and barrel, sold South Africans down the drain.
Very, very concerning. I want to come to the conversation that is always had when it comes to Eskom, because they themselves have essentially admitted to the fact that they are in trouble. Government argues that Eskom in its current form simply isn't financially sustainable. If you oppose unbundling, then what is your alternative for fixing a utility that's carrying hundreds and hundreds of billions of rand when it comes to debt?
No. I mean, the debt has been done away with. In 2015, I did a presentation to the then Economic Transformation Unit of the African National Congress, and who was chairing the current Minister of Treasury, Godongwana. And that presentation, I proposed that the debt had to be arrested, Eskom debt, and that actually we had to refinance it. Lo and behold, 2 years ago, they came up with the Eskom debt, bill that has now become an act, but effectively more than halved the debt of Eskom with the so-called, we want to strengthen the balance sheet of Eskom, whilst at the same time they were destroying it. Now, if you could be able to recognize the NTSA, the NTCSA, the National Transmission Company of South Africa assets at 3.1 trillion, what does that do for the balance sheet of Eskom? It actually puts it on a more solid footing. The problem, of course, arises in the fact that Eskom's financials, cash flows are so weak with the so-called municipal debt that is well over 105 billion rand to date and continuing to increase. Therefore, bailouts are going to continue, notwithstanding the rhetoric that Eskom is profitable. It is not cash flow positive, therefore it is in dire straits. But all of these things, they actually, the problem with the previous and the current government has that of complete disdain and disregard for subject matter experts like myself, who are the authority globally on matters of energy. Recently, I wrote to President Cyril Ramaphosa and pleaded with him. I then wrote an op-ed, which I called Eskom Forge Connect, because as a result of customers migrating off Eskom, deindustrialization at unprecedented scale, with largely smelters closing down, therefore also relegating to the past to the dustbin of history, relegating to the dustbin of history the so-called beneficiation mantra, which they have been repeating. All of these things, I wrote to President, said, right now, Eskom sits with over 4,000 megawatts. And during this winter season, it's actually almost 7,000 megawatts of excess electricity that Eskom cannot sell to anybody. I then made a proposal, a far-reaching proposal to say that scarce asset that we now sit with, which is called excess electricity, it must be reconfigured to be a pivotal player in the artificial intelligence economy, whereby we can attract, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into this economy over the next 5 years. And lo and behold, of course, he has not responded. But if anything, they are pushing ahead with spending well over 440 billion rand to construct a transmission line which will never be usable. If anything, will exacerbate the conditions of financial hardship ultimately for the taxpayer, because National Treasury will have to take very limited financial resources to bail out the already what will be an indebted to the tune of 440 billion rand, the National Transmission Company of South Africa.
I want to come to, examples around the world. We've seen countries in recent times liberalizing their electricity markets with varying degrees, of course, when it comes to success. Are there any kind of examples where unbundling has clearly failed, and are there examples where it has actually worked and the residents of those countries reap the rewards thereof?
Unbundling has failed everywhere else in the world. There's no record of success, and they know this. The question becomes, how can a cabinet and a parliament and the Eskom board and the Eskom management and NERSA and all of the ministers who know that there is no track record of success, there's no case study anywhere that we can be able to benchmark against, and yet continue to go down this road when the results are well known? If you listen to what is the talk in Britain today, the talk in Britain is now to renationalize this economic infrastructure companies that are very critical in order for the state to be able to grow. And because they all have now remembered all of this that are now having to, somersault and make a U-turn on that. They are remembering what Henry Kissinger once said, that the one who controls food supply controls the people. The one who controls the energy controls the whole continent. And right now, we know that, as a matter of fact, that when energy is controlled elsewhere, of course, the one who controls it controls us as well. And the one who controls money controls the world. We are now going to be slaves by borrowing a whopping 440 billion rand that we do not need, to build a transmission line that we do not need, even 1 kilometer of, in order to advance the greedy profiteering motives of this rent-seeking privateers. That is the deplorable state that South Africa finds itself in. And the lack of gumption to be able to say, how do we now make that giant leap forward into the AI economy using the existing state assets that have been built over a period of time? And you are asking about whether it's warranted to dismantle or unbundle Eskom. It can never be warranted, because the man who wrote the blueprint for the creation of Eskom, which is the greatest industrialist that Africa has ever seen, Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl, knew and understood the fundamentals, and therefore created to be an integrated utility. Not a surprise that in the 80s and in the 90s, Eskom was the fourth largest utility in the world, which was the lowest cost producer of electricity than any other utility in the world. The question comes, what happened that led us to move from being the lowest cost producer of electricity in the world to now being one of the highest, where we are benchmarked with the countries like Germany, which also bought into this snake oil false religion of renewables, therefore to the detriment of their economy, and they have deindustrialized, whether you're talking about Australia, Spain, Portugal, the United Kingdom, which is Britain specifically, and some of the states in the United States where all of them, they have been a complete and utter failure. And let nobody tell you about China, because the story of China is completely 100% misunderstood, because they are applying the so-called renewable energy responsibly. And the responsible way to apply renewable energy, so-called, is off-grid. And South Africa now has come to terms with that fact that off-grid application of the so-called renewable energy, particularly solar energy, is off-grid, and hence we are seeing them in their multitudes migrating off the Eskom grid, and therefore exacerbating the financial hardship. And smelters are closing and we are not attracting all other investments in the energy-intensive industries. All of this because of this cocktail of very poisonous policies and legislation that, after all, is aimed at one thing and one thing only: to control the 3.1 trillion asset called the Eskom transmission grid. Because once you can control the grid, and as Prince Mtombeni has aptly described it, that there is no energy anywhere that can move unless you have got access to that highway called the electricity transmission grid of Eskom, which is now almost 34,000 kilometers. And that is where the battle is. The battle of the soul of this country is going to be as the one who inherits, who gets bequeathed the 3.1 trillion asset for pittance. And that is I think, what analysts like myself look with total disbelief and horror, that South Africans by and large are not aware, notwithstanding that every time they are recharging their electricity, they know that they are getting far less units than they would have gotten a year before, 5 years earlier, and 10 years earlier.
Critics of your position, and you also asked this question, how did we get here? Critics of your position will argue that Eskom's problems weren't created by private companies. They were created by years and years of political interference, corruption, state capture, a story that we all know of what Eskom became. Then wouldn't structural reform become inevitable after everything Eskom has been through over the years?
No, the greedy, profiteering private sector effectively bribed the comprador bourgeoisie, which is the politicians, to enact legislation that favors them, so that they can be able to effectively plunder legally and then glorify it as fruits of free enterprise. So the private sector is 100% to blame.
How about the argument, which is also another important one, the fact that South Africa in itself simply doesn't have the fiscal space to continue bailing Eskom out? I think Treasury, they've already committed hundreds of billions of rands in debt relief. This, if taxpayers can't keep funding Eskom indefinitely, then where should the money come from your perspective?
Eskom should never have been indebted in the first instance.
But we are here now.
I'm an investment banker. I have got 26 years experience in the capital markets. So I know exactly what I'm talking about. And in 2009 and 2010, I warned. Just at the time, I didn't have or had no public platform to really talk on. But those that are in government know exactly my engagements with them, and not one of them can come and lie to the public that I never engaged them. I warned them that the manner in which they sought to finance new build of Medupi, Kusile, and Ingula was wrong, and that the manner in which they intended to fund the nuclear was wrong. that therefore they needed to talk to the bankers like myself who knew exactly how to do it. Of course, they disregarded that advice. And long story short, both Kusile and Midupi ended up with more than 3 times cost overruns what was initially budgeted for. And hence, Eskom then became into that position of indebtedness to the extent that the taxpayer had to bail them out in the with the hundreds of billions of rands that they've had to bail them out. And as though that, you couldn't have it worse. That now here you have got this government continuing on that road to plunder by even now ramming down our throats, increasing the debt profile, and say, well, because we don't have the fiscal space to be able to move it, to justify on why a 3.1 trillion valued asset called Eskom transmission grid must now be bequeathed to the private sector. And in order to be able to justify that, they undervalue it and say it is worth 84 billion, therefore bribing, because there's no better way to describe it, the so-called World Bank, so that they can sanitize and glorify the valuation of a measly 84 billion when the asset is worth 3.1 trillion, and therefore increase the debt, load 440 billion rand of debt on an 84 billion rand worth asset. So you must ask a simple question. If a 34,000 kilometer long transmission grid that has got the capacity to carry 55,000 megawatts of electricity, when our electricity consumption in South Africa today is well under 30,000, meaning that we have well over 27,000 megawatts of electricity that the current transmission is well capacitated to be able to carry, and it needs refurbishment. That was the basis of my submission and my formal presentation to the then Economic Transformation Desk of the ANC in 2015, that you needed to refurbish the transmission grid so that you reduce the transmission losses that are currently happening on that grid. And now they have come up with what? With a proposal to build another transmission grid. But it doesn't make sense. How can a 34,000 kilometer transmission grid, legacy grid, that has got one of the highest carrying capacities of voltage in the world, how can it therefore be worth 84 billion and you are proposing 14,000 kilometers of a much more lesser capacity? It needs 440 billion rand to build. It is insanity that even when they are now engaged in this road to plunder, they do so wantonly without any concern that the South Africans will ask any questions, because they know that they have bought every single politician in parliament. The question I'm asking, how can 400 members of parliament, not even one of them, have risen, as I suggested in the op-ed that I wrote in May 2024, just over 2 years ago, before the elections, where I was saying, will the members of parliament, the real members of parliament, who are patriots, who understand their mandate, will they rise up to oppose this? If anything, they supported the promulgation. So I can tell you, all 400 members of parliament, even in the so-called GNU government and in this administration, all of them, they are vicariously liable for the theft and the plunder that is ongoing, and that is going to result in effectively this country remaining in the deplorable state of arrested economic development, because we are now not even able to make those giant leaps. We talk about a country that, is it broken? We are now having a debate. Is the country broken, or is it maybe just near brokenness? Can it still be fixed? When at the end of the day, well, at the end of it all, we continue to agree to the promulgation of legislation, which, if anything, ensures that once and for all this country, if we just go back to the basics and said, what were the blueprints? What informed the blueprints of Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl when he created Eskom, when he created ISCO, and all other, groundbreaking industrialization tools for this country, which it is an absurdity of the highest order that when the Nationalist Party took power in 1948 and Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl died in 1949, that the Nationalist Party did not say, well, Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl was hired by the progressives, the liberals, what is now ultimately you can say the Democratic Alliance epitomizes and personifies ideology, which was more pro-colonial Britain, that the Nationalist Party did not throw away the blueprints of Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl. In fact, they embraced everything. Not only did they embrace everything, from 1963 to 1976, the Nationalist Party government did everything to the letter what Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl had proposed as a more sustainable and a more rather a better way to industrialize this nation, and to the extent that the Nationalist Party was investing 16% of the GDP in economic infrastructure, and the ANC government and even the so-called GNU government does not even invest 2% of the GDP in economic infrastructure.
Mr. Kgadima, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on show, and for those wonderful insights and perspective on one of the most consequential policy debates that's currently facing South Africa at this moment. Really appreciate it.
Shukran.
There we go. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with you after this.